Well, there are very few historians who've actually innovated a distinct subdiscipline. But that's exactly what today's Tawney lecturer, Professor Sir Roderick Floud, has done with anthropometrics, which he, along with John Komlos and Bob Fogel, of course, has pioneered. Anthropometrics is just as innovative for economic and social history as the rediscovery of language has been for cultural history. Truly, we can say that Roderick took us on a biological turn. And with anthropometrics has opened up a rich new seam of investigation for economic and social historians. He is a pioneer quantitative historian as well. I don't have time to go through his long and distinguished CV, but I also wanted to say that he has served our discipline in other ways in terms of managing, redeveloping, and nurturing the development of higher education in our capital city, and including developing access for less advantaged students to higher ed. And it's for services to higher education for which he received his knighthood. I also happen to know that today's a rather special day for Roderick. It is indeed his birthday, and a significant birthday at that. So I want to thank him very much for agreeing to give us a Tawney on what really should have been, and I know I'm kind of persona non grata with Cynthia at this point, for what should have really been a special day with his family. But he is actually here with a different family. So I hope we can all celebrate as well as enjoy the Tawney lecture.
Thank you, Jane. Let me begin by expressing my thanks to the President and to the Society for this invitation. It's a long time since I first came to an Economic History Society conference, and it's a particular pleasure to be here at apparently the largest of the conferences ever held. Can I also express my thanks to you? Jane describes you as the survivors. I hope you survive the next hour as you've survived the rest of the conference. But it's also a pleasure to be asked to give the Tawney lecture because R.H. Tawney has always been one of my heroes because of his commitment to social justice, his commitment to part-time and continuing education, and his work on what at the time was known as Tawney's Century, an important part of my own undergraduate education. And I'm very pleased to pay tribute to his memory, not today by presenting research results, as others have recently done, but rather by reflecting on the current state of our profession and its place within society and the economy. Just about 4 months ago, 2 important policy documents were published. They will together determine research funding in our discipline and across all disciplines in Europe and in Britain for the next decade. The first was the European Union document, Horizon 2020, intended to boost research, innovation and competitiveness in Europe. It merited, I think, half a page in the Times Higher, but it's actually a proposal for the investment of 80 billion euro between 2014 and 2020. The other document, which got a bit more publicity, was the government's Innovation and Research Strategy for Growth, a strategy for annual expenditure of more than £5 billion. Now, in both of these documents, and in many more, innovation is the name of the game. Innovation is seen as the solution to Britain's and Europe's, and no doubt the world's, economic problems in the short and medium term. Innovation is specifically the justification to the public, the taxpayer as they're now called, who pay for it, for expenditure on research in universities and research institutes. So, as you can see, the coalition government is putting innovation and research at the heart of its growth agenda, the justification for spending this large sum of money. Now, few economic historians would dispute the view that innovation has, particularly during the last 3 centuries, but probably forever, been an essential component of economic growth and societal change. But the history of innovation and the history of the study of innovation should, I think, lead us to question whether achieving innovation and economic growth is as simple a process as governments seem to be assuming. Now, one of the oddities which I want to focus on in both these documents is that they assume that the main, if not the only task, is to stimulate innovation in manufacturing industry. If one reads, struggles rather, but if one reads through Innovation and Research Strategy for Growth, one finds that, except for a section on computer games, everything in our government strategy is concerned with the making of things. And 4 out of the 5 key challenges listed in the European document are about manufacturing industry. Now, this seems to me to be very surprising. The internationally accepted definition of innovation, the so-called Oslo Manual, makes it clear that innovation is much broader than change in manufacturing alone. As you can see, the Oslo definition includes goods and services and processes and marketing methods and organizational methods and workplace organization and external relations. And the OECD believes that areas of the economy other than manufacturing have, in the past decades, been major sources of innovation and drivers of economic growth. Market services have become the main driver of the economy. Services are also the main source of job creation. Now, this probably remains true. These are, of course, statements from 5 years ago, before the crash. But in fact, I think that they're likely still to be true. And every economic historian knows that economic growth over the past 150 years has seen a declining share of manufacturing and primary production and agriculture in the labor force and the overall economy, and a compensating rise in the share of services. Now, the OECD document shows quite clearly that in 3 crucial countries, the Netherlands, the United Kingdom, and the United States, services has become a larger and larger proportion of the economy. And in every G7 country at the moment, services account for about 75% of the economy, manufacturing for 25% or less. Now, this long-term change in the balance of our economies is universally seen as a problem. Our politicians have long bemoaned the decline of manufacturing, seeing it wrongly, of course, as this graph shows, as peculiar to Britain. Now, in a time of financial crisis, they want to, quote, rebalance our economy, and to do so by stimulating innovation in manufacturing. And as a result, opportunities for growth and innovation in the rest of the economy, the vast bulk of the economy, are being neglected or disregarded. This matters. It reduces the search for the solution to society's problems to mechanical answers. It's as if the only solution to crime is to devise better burglar alarms, or the only solution to population aging is to invent better Zimmer frames. And moreover, an emphasis on making things immediately diminishes the role of the social sciences, which analyze problems which don't have easy mechanical solutions, and it justifies spending much less on them in the documents that I began with, envisaged in the documents that I began with, than on the STEM subjects, science, technology, and medicine. Now, I find this odd. Why has it happened? Why, in economies which are dominated by service industries and in which virtually every politician actually comes from a service industry, if they've had any experience of work at all, why do politicians yearn for the golden age of the Industrial Revolution? Why has the rural idyll, beloved of the 19th century, been replaced by romanticizing mill, factory, and brickyard? There are, I think, two principal reasons. The first is ideology, and the second is measurement. First, the ideology. It's really composed of a number of interlinked beliefs, and the first, I think, is a popular theory of value. Recall that the physiocrats in the 17th and 18th centuries saw all value as stemming from the land. This particular economic theory, of course, failed to survive the Industrial Revolution, and at which point the labor theory of value, although already criticized in a sense or by Adam Smith, saw the problem, the labor theory of value was enunciated. Now we count all market activities as part of GDP, but physiocracy lives on in the popular and political imagination and mind in the view that value or wealth is created only by the making, growing, or mining of tangible objects. If one listens to the rhetoric, you find that politicians and many others consider that manufacturing is wealth creating, while all other economic activities, apart from agriculture possibly, particularly if they're in the public sector, are non-productive, wealth-consuming, and therefore inferior. This view is remarkably widespread. I can remember, I think when I was president of Universities UK, being assailed by an alliance of the then president of the Royal Society and a Labour MP from a northern industrial area. I'd suggested that the service sector, doctors, scientists, carers, also create value. They found this incomprehensible and offensive. The second linked belief is held by many natural scientists and engineers, like a recent, I won't name names, president of the Royal Society. It's the so-called linear model. This states that investment in fundamental research will lead to applied research, which will lead to invention, to innovation, and to economic growth. The best way to stimulate growth, therefore, is to spend more on fundamental research and on training more scientists and engineers. This is why science, technology, and medicine, the STEM subjects, are protected and have been protected for decades in higher education funding. The third linked belief underlying this ideology, I think, is simple industrial romanticism. It echoes the awe and wonder with which the Romantic poets and artists greeted the Industrial Revolution. Making things is exciting or fulfilling, while teaching, caring, or serving is not. As the design correspondent of The Guardian put it, a consumer or service economy will never make us happy. We must rescue ourselves economically through more of us making intelligent, useful, and profitable things. And he did this, oddly, in the course of an article entitled Doing It the German Way. If you put your mind back to the slide I showed earlier of the G7 countries, you will see that Germany also has less than 25% of its people making things. So the ideology which links these beliefs is a very strong one. It sees the entire course of economic change in all developed countries over the past 2 centuries as a mistake. It's a mistake which must be reversed by governmental action to stimulate manufacturing and therefore science and engineering at the expense of everybody else. If such policies have failed over the past 50 years, as they manifestly have, this is merely a reason for spending even more money on them. Now, this ideology, I think, has been reinforced by problems of measurement. It's very difficult to measure the output and hence the productivity of services in general and of those in the public sector in particular. How do you measure these public servants? Conventional national accounts, in addition, didn't classify investment in intangible assets, such as software or the internet, as the equivalent of investment in machines. And all this led to the conclusion that it was very difficult to achieve increases in productivity through innovation and investment in services. It was even argued that it was impossible to achieve or envisage improvements in the quality of many services. How could you improve on the performance of a Beethoven string quartet? And the rise of services was therefore attributed to the fact that they couldn't increase their efficiency as rapidly as could manufacturing. In fact, as I'm sure you know, national income calculations often assumed that the output was equivalent to the inputs, principally of labor, and implied that it was impossible for teachers or doctors or care assistants to become more efficient or to improve the quality of what they do. And it was, unfortunately, some of these measurement problems that made the service sector and the public sector in particular an easy target for politicians to argue that services, and particularly non-market services, were inefficient compared to manufacturing or the private sector. Now, all this has recently been challenged. This is a description of the past, but a rather pervasive past. We know that national statisticians, the OECD, Nesta, have all improved their estimates of output in investment in services. In our own discipline, economic historians such as Steve Broadberry and Bob Millward have rewritten the history of the service sector, emphasizing its increasing profitability. However, even if we now realize that services are central to our economy and to raising productivity, hardly anybody else seems to do so. Politicians, as I said, want to rebalance the economy. Investment in research is heavily skewed towards the manufacturing sector. The capacity of social science to contribute towards the solution of society's problems is undervalued. And all of this matters to us as social scientists and as citizens of Britain and of Europe. Now, what can we do about this? One thing, perhaps the first thing that we can do, is to increase our understanding. As these two quotes from Nate Rosenberg show, perhaps the most distinguished historian, together with Paul David, of technology and innovation, we still don't really understand innovation in manufacturing, and in services we've hardly begun. So I want to propose that we begin with ourselves in the spirit of the biblical proverb, "Physician, heal thyself." We're part of the knowledge economy, we're part of the public sector, we also sell what we produce. Can we gain some insight into output and productivity in services and into the possible contribution of the social sciences by measuring our own service? There's been, I think, remarkably little introspection about our discipline, or indeed social science as a whole. Nate Rosenberg commented, as you can see, that looking at scientific research as if it were an economic enterprise has hardly occurred. The Journal of Economic Literature last published an article on the economics of science in 1996. And within economic history, nobody has really taken up Nedgley's challenge, issued in 1975, to examine rigorously how our subject has grown. Now, of course, some academics do think it's demeaning to have to justify what they do. I'm happy to have been an economic historian for all the reasons expressed here. But I'm also a social scientist because I want to be useful by helping to explain society and by training generations of students to do the same. And I don't find it demeaning to demonstrate how useful we are or how much, dread word, impact our work has had. Physical scientists and engineers continually do it. Why shouldn't we? But how do we do it? The greatest difficulty in describing and explaining innovation and change in services lies in measuring its output, both in quantity and in quality. So how would we measure our output? What do we do? Well, we create and transmit knowledge by teaching, research, and publication. Our output is with them, our students. It's our books, our articles, and the impact that all these have on others in our profession and in the wider world. I'm not going to go into the question of measuring students because the classification issues are horrendous. And therefore one has to fall back, as so often in universities, unfortunately perhaps, on research and try to measure think how we can measure our research output. We don't have yet the bibliometric tools that are commonplace in other disciplines. We don't even have, like our cognate discipline, economics, a rigid hierarchy of journals to assist us. What we do have, actually, is an unusual resource in the social sciences, and that is an annual list of publications on British economic and social history, which has appeared in the review almost every year since its foundation in 1925. Now, you've all, I'm sure, used the annual list of publications, and you will immediately be thinking about its defects. It doesn't cover work on the rest of the world. It's about British social and economic history. Its accuracy depends on its compilers. And since I was one of them at one point in my career, I know how flaky that can sometimes be, or how chancy, perhaps. Its coverage has changed, although actually only very little. And it is simply a list with no indication of quality. Books, articles, pamphlets, and ephemera are implicitly given equal weight. But one has to take the tools that are to hand. What can we make of it? That is, this graph shows the change that's occurred in numbers of publications, taking them all together. And I very much acknowledge the painstaking work of Nedgley and Giorgio Riello. Having only done 10 years of it, I really sympathize with the task that they undertook in doing a much longer period of about 75 years. The total number of publications, as you can see, shows a very large rise, both in books and in journal articles. One surprise, at least to me, was that the number of books has continued to rise so substantially, particularly in recent years, in the last 25 years. And the books, as you can see, form close to 50% of all publications in many categories and many years, something that has to be taken into account in bibliometric data based exclusively on journal articles. Now, how do we judge this record? Has it become easier to publish in our subject, so that the growth in publications is an example of more means worse? Editors of journals, some of whom are here today, are in the best position to make such a judgment, but I don't see a decline in quality. It seems to me that the books and articles that now appear are more comprehensive in their coverage of the evidence, certainly more comprehensive in their coverage of the world, and deeper in analytic rigor. And the books, in particular, have to meet a market test, I'll come back to that in a minute, which certainly indicates a demand for what's published. So I think it would be difficult to conclude that quality has declined. But what about productivity? It would be possible, although extremely tedious, to count how many people wrote all these, or are writing all these books and articles. But I don't know what it would tell you anyway. It wouldn't in itself give you a sense of the size of the researcher community which has generated work in British social and economic history. For that, I think an appropriate proxy is the membership of the Economic History Society. Now, you'll all be thinking of the caveats, or one doesn't have to be a member in order to publish. Many copies of the review are sold and read in libraries, but by people who aren't members. There's electronic distribution, but nevertheless, it gives you a sense of the scholarly community involved in our subject who are producing the publications which I've mentioned. Individual membership has fallen substantially in recent years, but to produce a rough index of productivity, the publications per head have continued to increase and are now about 7 times what they were in the 1920s. Now, these are very rough and contentious figures, but we can reasonably claim, I think, that our productivity has substantially increased. What else can we glean from this material? Work on British economic and social history has appeared in 2010 in 191 journals. Now, an interesting question, it seems to me, is what is our impact on other disciplines? Are we reaching into cognate areas and other social sciences? Of course, it is only British social and economic history, and therefore we're ignoring a whole slew of material and work on other parts of the world. But the picture, as far as those 191 journals are concerned, isn't actually very encouraging. Almost all of them are British journals of history or economic history. There are remarkably few from other disciplines or other countries. Little economic history, in particular, appears in the mainstream economics journals, where I'm sure we would all argue there's certainly a need for learning from history. And this picture is less encouraging, I'm sure, than it would have been in the early years of the society. We may be increasing our productivity, but not our impact. I said that it seemed to me that the books that are published are, in a sense, a market test. How do we do in the market? What's the value of sales? Now, we don't know what it is for the entire corpus of publications, but this is material from Cambridge University Press, probably the leading publisher in our field. And this seems to me to give a very encouraging picture. Over £500,000 of sales, rapidly growing sales over the past 5 years. It would be good to have similar figures from other major publishers. So I would conclude, but I'm sure this is contentious, that there have been substantial increases in our productivity. That as a service industry, we're doing quite well. But where has this come from? How far has it been the product of innovation or the result of exogenous technological change? Has it been induced by institutional change within the subject or in academia more generally? Substantial increases in labour productivity have traditionally occurred in the context of technical change. And the major technological change which we've lived through is undoubtedly the IT revolution. The OECD and Nesta studies that I referred to earlier both make it clear that IT is responsible for much of the productivity change that they've identified in the service sector of the economy as a whole. And of course, the computer is now part of all our lives. But it's still perhaps sensible to reflect on quite how rapidly and how pervasively this technical innovation has affected us. Remember that in the early 1960s, the process of calculation had hardly changed since the days of Newton, or at least since the invention of logarithms. Mechanical calculators became available only during the 1950s. Max Cole recalled that his work with Phyllis Dean on national income history was greatly facilitated by the fact he was able to ask for the help of a young lady known as the computer in the Department of Applied Economics. But anything more complex was nearly impossible. Stan Ingerman reminded me of a colleague who spent an entire summer calculating a regression analysis with 3 independent variables. Now, the point I want to make is that economic historians were early and enthusiastic adopters of the new technology. The new economic history, as I'll say in a minute, is essentially that early adoption. We immediately saw the benefits in data capture, in data storage, in data processing and analysis, then later on in word processing, presentational software. And now we're reaping the benefits of digitization and search tools. And the change has been, at least to those who've lived through it, amazing. I remember using the KDF-9 computer in Oxford in the mid-1960s, at the same time as Tawney Wrigley and Roger Schofield were laboriously transporting their data to the equivalent machine in Newcastle. The KDF-9 cost well over £1 million in the prices of the day, about £15 million. Its memory was 150th of that of the iPhone in my pocket. The storage of data was on punch cards or paper tape. They were laborious to create and lug around. They demanded fixed and limited formats. The transformation in the 1960s, and again I think economic historians were at the forefront of this, or very close to the forefront of this, really came essentially in data storage. The advent of data entry terminals, the transformation of data collection which came with the laptop. Bob Fogel calculates that the cost of collecting his Union Army pension records would have been over $100 million using the technology of the late 1980s, some 10 times what it actually cost when he conducted his work during the 1990s. So processing cost and speed has been transformed. We've escaped from something that the younger members of the audience won't remember, but it's called turnaround time, which bedeviled our lives. There have also been the benefits of improved software, statistical, analytical, and in the processing of alphabetic data. So I think one cannot easily underestimate the impact that the technological change of IT has had on our subject. However, it's very difficult to quantify that impact, but just to assert that it's been transformative. But I think it's unlikely that it accounts for all the productivity increase in our subject. If we were able to undertake a total factor productivity analysis and to take account of investment in intangibles of this kind, it's still likely there would be a substantial residual. Part of that productivity increase may stem from working harder, and although vice-chancellors don't always admit this, most academics have worked harder and harder in recent decades. But much must be due to our innovations. What have those innovations been? What can we say about innovation in our subject, and how do we explain it? First, what is an innovation in our subject, or in the social sciences in general? Here are 3 possible definitions. Sloboda, who is a media specialist and psychologist, has a rather catch-all definition. Every book or article is creative or innovative provided somebody wants to read it. It's a catch-all. Koestler, at the bottom here, requires interdisciplinarity, which I think, again, is too restrictive. I can't see why you cannot have innovative activity within a discipline. So I come back to the Oslo definition, defining what I mean as innovation as a substantial change which sends our subject in a new direction. Now, where again does this come from? I just want to use 4 examples of innovations in our subject over the past decades, recent decades. National income history, the new economic history, demographic history, and anthropometric history. And I would argue that these have together transformed our knowledge, at least of the British economy, but often of other parts of the world over recent decades. They're not, of course, the only innovations. They're just the ones that I happen to perhaps know more about. Others might be business history in the mold of Alfred Chandler. It might be institutional economic history. It certainly probably ought to be global economic history. But looking at these innovations, what lessons can we learn from them? To find out, I've been interviewing a number of economic historians and reading the thoughts and memories of others as helpfully devised or compiled by Pat Hudson and others. I'd argue on the basis of this that innovation in our subject involves at least 5 things: teamwork, leadership, argument, money, and luck. First, teamwork. Social psychologists who've studied creativity agree on one maxim, probably they only agree on one thing, that is, 2 heads are better than 1. Although the popular perception of an inventor and an entrepreneur may be that of a lone individual, most advances have come from teams. In our subject, teamwork in the 1950s, stimulated by Simon Kuznets on a world scale, and then made by Phyllis Dean, Max Cole, and a bit later Charles Feinstein, created, as you can see, what Tawney Wrigley sees as possibly the most influential single work of the last half century. And Steve Broadberry agrees. And Feinstein and Brian Mitchell opened more doors in the 1950s and 1960s with their careful underpinning of historical statistics and many other contributions to the field. Shortly after that, Peter Laslett and Tawney Wrigley gathered round them a group which transformed English demographic history. They also made use of what Louis Henry, the French demographer, described as le secret weapon anglais, the team of local historians who transcribed the records of births, marriages, and deaths. Anthropometric history also grew from teamwork. The team was interdisciplinary, an example of what Brodel called interscience. The original idea of measuring health by the use of height data came from a demographer, James Trussell, but it required the combined skills of historians, economists, statisticians, and particularly Jim Tanner, a human biologist, to realize its potential and to grapple with its difficulties. It took several years to understand the implications of anthropometry and to integrate the work of scholars in other fields. But it was essentially a team effort. The word teamwork may seem less applicable to the new economic history, because they worked on diverse topics, but they had a sense of a common purpose to integrate economic theory and quantitative methods into economic history. This meant that they functioned as a team, bouncing ideas off each other and introducing new methods to each other. Their emphasis on the collection of large data sets meant that they had to become, as soon as they could raise the money, leaders of teams. All of them emphasized how much they learned from each other. The best description of them might be individualistic teamwork. Teamwork, I think, is particularly important in interdisciplinary work. It's extremely difficult for one person or even a team which got on as well together as the early anthropometricians did to master the breadth of relevant literature. You require intense discussion, interminable discussion sometimes, truly to understand the preconceptions and methods of another discipline. And I often recall the words of H.J. Habakkuk, my supervisor, "One man cannot think in 2 ways." And I concluded that actually it was a team that made it possible to do that. My second characteristic of innovation is leadership. This was particularly important in demographic history, I think, where Peter Laslett and Tawney Wrigley were the risk-taking entrepreneurs. Tawney giving up substantial positions in Cambridge to become director of the Cambridge Group. In anthropometric history, the team was created by Bob Fogel, much encouraged by Stan Engerman. Leadership, as I implied earlier, became increasingly important as the money became more important, as data sets and research teams became larger. And with leadership comes responsibility for the team and its financing. Bob Fogel and others speak of spending half their time raising funds for research. But leadership of the kind displayed by Fogel is much more than that of writing grant applications. The leader has to choose team members who can work with each other. My third characteristic is argument. Innovation brings and stems from controversy. As Schumpeter emphasized when he spoke of creative destruction, an innovation implies overturning an old paradigm. Often, if not always, this is resisted. Historical national income analysis was probably the least controversial of our four innovations, although the DAE, the Department of Applied Economics, was often criticized for wasting time and money on history. But the other three were very controversial. The new economic history sparked ferocious disputes, as did the similar quantitative turn in other social science disciplines. I was interested, in fact, at a recent seminar at the British Academy to learn how much the disputes are still going on in other social science disciplines, 30 or 40 years after the beginning of the impact, as I've said, of the IT and the quantitative revolution. In the early years, the disputes were between the cleometricians and the old guard, who tended to resent being called that, perhaps reasonably. Counterfactual analysis was derided, I can remember, at economic history conferences by economic historians such as Jack Fisher. The cleometricians weren't easily cowed. Bob Fogel put his years of training as a communist student organizer to good use, as Lenin confronting the Mensheviks. But he wasn't the only one who saw the new economic history as akin to a crusade. Some of the fiercest disputes were later within the Crusaders. The controversies about time on the cross were wounding, so I think particularly because they split asunder a group that had previously worked so well together. The findings of the Cambridge Group have sparked heated debate, but always, I think, largely between demographers who shared the basic preconceptions. Not so anthropometrics, where early results were met with incredulity, if not derision. Now, I have to confess that my first reaction when Bob Fogel asked me to work with him on the anthropometric data was equally one of great skepticism, so I'm not surprised that others felt equally skeptical. But the later reaction of economists and historians taught me that interdisciplinary research and innovation demands a thick skin. I was told by economists that anthropometry could tell us nothing about living standards, which were to be defined solely by real wages. Historians insisted that any change or difference in height was genetically determined. I think a signal of the deficiencies of the English educational system in that 100 years of debate about nature and nurture had passed them by. Only, actually, among human biologists did I and others feel welcome. Times have changed, of course, and if Jane's very pleasant remarks about anthropometrics are to be believed, then they have changed substantially. But doubts, of course, still remain. So controversy, I think, is absolutely crucial to innovation in the social sciences and has, of course, to be welcomed, even if it's sometimes painful. Fourth, among my topics is money. It's a myth, one in which social scientists as well as humanities studies have been complicit, that research in our disciplines is cheap. All I need is time, people say. They forget that they also need a salary, a room, preferably a 500-year-old library and access to the internet and all other kinds of modern technology. All four of the innovations that I've mentioned have been expensive, although I've been unable actually to quantify that, even with Bob Fogle's work. They required long-term investment and support from research councils and universities. Large armies of research assistants, substantial investment in new technology. This may be an unpopular statement to make, but I think the unsung heroes of innovation in economic history, at least so far as my four examples are concerned, are the research councils. It required imagination and faith to invest as heavily as they did in both the UK and the US. They supported young scholars without track records. They continued to support innovative research as it became more and more expensive. Committees of the SSRC, now ESRC, were important supporters, and in the United States, a very important role was played by directors at the National Institute of Aging and Health and the National Science Foundation. All were attacked for wasting public money on social science at all, let alone history. Bob Fogle's initial grant for the Union Army research was derided in the New York Times as a total waste of money, only 9 months before he won the Nobel Prize. And the European Science Foundation and the European Commission and the European Research Council have had to face down similar criticism, and I think deserve our thanks and our support. Fifth and finally, luck. As Bob Fogle puts it, you've got to be lucky. Luck is often crucial in framing questions and in finding data. And Asimov, as you can see, wrote that the important words in science are not eureka, but that's funny. It's the mold on a culture that changes the face of science. In our field, the chances of data discovery are often crucial. I've always found the most interesting set of anthropometric data to be the records of the boys recruited by the Marine Society, which I began to work on and many others have now used again. They were found not by me, but by Sarah Palmer, who happened to be showing some students the library stacks of the National Maritime Museum, and by chance, just the chance of where she was standing, picked one of the Marine Society volumes off the shelves. But as important, however, is that's funny. Fogle and Engerman's work on slavery was the result of a back-of-the-envelope calculation to work out exactly how inefficient was slave labor. And on the envelope, they discovered to their surprise that it appeared to be efficient. Nick Kraft's work on the Industrial Revolution, enormously influential, began when he couldn't understand some inconsistencies in Dean and Cole. Douglas North began to realize that Chicago neoclassicism couldn't give him the tools he needed. Patrick O'Brien became dissatisfied with the traditional accounts of the role of the state. As he puts it, one gets a niggling sense that one could do better. No one among the economic historians that I've talked to had what you could call a eureka moment. I do remember several how could I have been so stupid moments, usually about mistakes in coding or analyzing data, but I will confess that despite working next to Eric Hobsbawm and talking to him almost every day and teaching the standard of living debate, it took me about 3 years to realize that heights might be relevant to that discussion. Data collection takes a long time, and innovation seems to proceed by the slow accretion of knowledge rather than by sudden insight. Inquiry is often stimulated by a chance remark by a colleague over coffee, or by the role of others, as you can see from this, from the remarks of Robin Matthews and Bill Parker. It's remarkable how often Simon Kuznets, for an older generation, and recently Stan Engerman, are mentioned as sources of ideas. But there are other factors that are important in perhaps encouraging luck, if you like, put it that way. Peer support and encouragement. Encouragement from a body like this, as well as criticism, are crucial. And Patrick quite rightly says, I think we should flatter each other more. And I think one shouldn't forget, as Nick Crafts emphasized, the importance of improvement and innovation in graduate training. So, teamwork, leadership, controversy, money, luck, and peer support, to add a sixth, seem to be the main drivers of innovation in our subject, and probably in the social sciences in general. They enabled us to take advantage of the change in our technology from the IT revolution, and there's no sign of the innovation, I think, failing. So what conclusions can we draw for the future of our subject and for public policy on research and innovation? Here we have economic history, past, present, and I'm sure the future. What is it going to do? Well, I think the first thing we have to do is constantly to emphasize that we have to analyze and deal with the economy as it is. We shouldn't hark back, and we shouldn't tolerate the harking back to some mythical golden age of happy mechanics. We've demonstrated through our own work and through our analysis that an economy can be showing a declining proportion of manufacturing and still becoming more efficient and innovative. We certainly need to improve and expand manufacturing through industrial policy, but we need to do that across all ranges of all sectors, including our own, in relation to their potential. Second, just as the service sector of the economy as a whole demonstrates that it can innovate and raise its productivity, so must we emphasize can social science. The social sciences and humanities aren't some backwater. They aren't the haunt of lone scholars skulking in libraries. They have been, as I say, at the forefront of technological change. They have a great deal to contribute to solving problems which aren't simply mechanical, the preserve of manufacturing, or the physical and engineering sciences. All the challenges, and I won't go through them all, for Europe, which the EC has identified, are applicable to the social sciences as much, if not more, than to the other scientific disciplines. And we've demonstrated by the innovation that's taken place in our subject and in the other social sciences that we can make major contributions. It follows that the social sciences can and must demand a fair share of the research funds devoted to these challenges. Research in economic history and the social sciences generally will become more costly as we continue to exploit larger and larger data sets. The implications of potential work in, just to take two, network analysis based on the enormous increase in knowledge that comes from digitization of so many more archives and documents. And in a different field, advances in human biology, neuroscience, and epigenetics are going to influence, I think, much of our understanding of the past as well as of the present. We can demonstrate that investment in these fields and in the infrastructure and facilities that they need will pay off. We need research grants, we need conferences and networks, we need information technology. However, we've got things to do. We do, I think, need to redouble our efforts to understand innovation in general and in the service sector in particular. Innovation science is a developing and rapidly developing discipline, and certainly deserves, I think, more attention from us and from society as a whole. We must, as I've argued, escape from the mindset which privileges the making of things. We must study the media and creative industries, the services and professions, health and welfare, as intensively as in the past we studied machine tools, mines, or railways. And I have to confess that looking back on the Cambridge Economic History of Modern Britain, I think that we fell into the mindset of privileging manufacturing and so on much too easily. I hope that the fourth edition, now in preparation, will rectify some of that. So The Tawney Lecture is, for me, an occasion to reflect on ourselves and our subject, and to place us within society and the economy and the scholarly community. I would argue, on the basis of the evidence that I've produced, rough and ready though much of it has been, that we have made substantial innovations in our field, and we need, on that basis, to assert ourselves, both as historians and as social scientists. I wouldn't have been an economic historian for about 50 years if I didn't believe that we have much to offer. At times, over that period, all of us can remember that the profession was in a state of depression, worried about jobs and promotions and whether there were any young people coming into the profession. I don't think that the evidence justifies depression. We've done well, and we, I'm sure, will continue to do so. Thank you.